Hello, genealogists, it's Craig. And as part of our, like 100 episodes ago, I did something on creating a genealogical collection. And part of it was in and out migration. And I've been waiting a while to get this book on American migration routes in, part one, Indian Pass, Post Roads, and Wagon Roads, which is very early on, and it's full of a lot of color pictures, maps, and the trails and things like that. And there is going to be a part two, I understand, and it's going to deal with the roads in the 1850 time frame. And that's what I was waiting for. And I thought I would do this big thing on the Carey Eldridge atlases, such as this one on Appalachian trails to the Ohio River, and atlas of southern trails to the Mississippi, and the various atlases that she has, including one on German migration and America. And she has one, two, three, 6 atlases, maybe 7. And when I sat down to go through it, I decided, it's too confusing. There's no way that I can actually deal with this adequately in one session. So what I thought I would do is, since it seems that most people like smaller sessions rather than larger sessions, that I can deal with each one of these one by one. So what I thought I would do is start with my favorite one, which is Appalachian Trails to the Ohio River. These are all published by, or I should say, they were originally published by Carey Eldridge, and now they're published by Heritage Books. If they have the fancy laminated cover, that means that Heritage Books did it. And if they have sort of a plain or a cover that does not have a lamination, and like Atlas of Trails west of the Mississippi River, like this one, these were produced by Elderkin, which is Carey Eldridge. And she has determined that she's had enough, and I took them over for her. Because that's what I do, is I take things over for people. I've received a recent complaint from a friend of mine that pretty soon there won't be anybody left but me. It's not my fault. I just want this stuff to all remain in print. That's all. So, sorry about the diatribe, but let's talk about the Atlas of Appalachian Trails to the Ohio River. And I'll just wander through it with you so that you can have a sense of what we're talking about in this series of records. She basically talks about, because it is to the Ohio River, which isn't very far away from the Atlantic Ocean when you think about it, what we're dealing with is the trails in the early English settlements prior to the Revolution. Because remember that prior to the Revolution, although there were people going farther west, there weren't sufficient people going farther west to create trails. In other words, there were no wagons of any sort heading west in 1650 or 1745. They all butted up against the mountains or against the river. So the mountains basically in this time frame were a physical barrier. And remember, the King's Proclamation of 1763 prevented folks from heading west anyway, at least for settlement. That doesn't mean there weren't long hunters going out there. And we actually have a book on long hunters, which is very good and sold at reenactment stores and that kind of stuff. But remember that we have the Tidewater area that goes up to the fall line. And then we have the Piedmont that goes from the fall line to the foothills of the mountains, to the mountains themselves. So we basically have these 3 different areas. So people are living in the mountains, they're just not living beyond the mountains. At first, it appears that the way people got to places was they got above the fall line and then they took the river. And they went to the river gaps, and that was the end of it. It also meant that in this time period, roads were north and south, not really east and west. I mean, there were east and west pieces, but the major highways, such as the King's Highway, those were north and south because those were the only directions you could actually go. Now, there were some major Indian trails in this time frame, and depending on how far back we are going, how colonial we are getting, shall we say, you could have the Old Connecticut Path, which is early on, the Iroquois Trail, which is about 1700, the Lake Trail, which basically is a way to get to the Great Lakes, the Getanging Path, which is in Pennsylvania, connected the Delaware River with the Susquehanna River, and Susquehanna is about as far west as we're going in this time frame. Namacolia's Path, which until this moment I'd never heard of, was a path which connected the Chesapeake Bay with the forks of the Ohio from Alexandria to Winchester to the Potomac River and then west. And this was Virginia's main route to Pittsburgh. This was probably pre-Braddock's Road, pre-Forbes Road. And then the Great Trail from the forks of the Ohio, which of course is Fort Duquesne or Pittsburgh, and into northeast Ohio, joining the Lake Trail and then on to Detroit. And then the Seneca Trail, which is in northern New York, the Warriors Path, with the Seminole Trail, which is a more southern trail that connected the Great Lakes to the south, the Gulf Coast, and also to Kentucky. And eventually, the Warriors Path or the Seminole Trail will become the Great Wagon Road, which is pretty much along the line of what was Route 11 until there was Interstate 81, so in that area of the valley. Then there is the Falls of the Ohio Trail, which connected this Warriors Path by way of the Cumberland Gap to Kentucky and the Ohio River. And then there's the trail that is the Scioto Trail, which is Chillicothe, and it joins up with the Lake Trail and the Salt Licks of Kentucky. So all of these trails existed pretty much for two purposes. One, for Native Americans to wander up and down them, and two, for fur traders and long hunters to wander down the path. The first building of the road system ends up going to the fall line. Now, if you know the fall line, like that's at Richmond, the rapids at Richmond, Roanoke Rapids in North Carolina, the fall line sort of moves around. It's not like this straight line, but it's basically where you have to portage to go upriver. You can't go across the falls. Imagine, I've watched many times kayaks try to get over the falls at Potomac Falls. I've yet to see one do it. I've seen some come very close, but I've yet to see anybody do it yet. So one of the main roads that we have to deal with in this time period, and we're dealing between 1650 and 1670, the Virginians especially start sending people out west, and not very far, as far as the Blue Ridge Mountains, which from the perspective of Virginia is not that far. And they developed a trail that would end up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it would begin much farther north, more likely in Philadelphia, and it was known as the Carolina Road. And this is how people got to, remember that we're only moving north and south in this time frame, and this is how people got to the south or returned home to the north. It's been known as the Carolina Road, it's the Upper Road, it's the Rogues Road, and today it's generally what is Route 15. And it, prior to the Revolution, was the major way that people got north and south. Then there was the Great Wagon Road, which was from Philadelphia, and it basically went up the valley. And it would become the major thoroughfare in the 1725 to 1750 time frame. There's a great book, long out of print, and the author now escapes me, called The Great Wagon Road. It was published by Dietz Press. And why I can't remember. But anyway, great book. Now, at the time of the French and Indian War, which would be 1750 time frame, there was a trail all the way to the Cumberland Gap, and it pretty much ended. And there was a trail all the way up to Pittsburgh. And that's about the only ways that you could actually get west. Again, we have the Great Wagon Road and the Carolina Road, and the King's Highway, people going north and south, but very little westward movement. And then, during the French and Indian War, first Braddock builds a road that eventually will be known as pretty much Route 40 in Pennsylvania, US 40. And then that not being good enough, General Forbes comes through and he creates a road, and that is Route 30 in Pennsylvania, which is north of Braddock's Road. Those were just barely trails. They hardly were, they weren't designed for someone to move a family along. They were designed to move armies, small armies, to the west. By 1766, after the French and Indian War, we see an extension of the trail from the Cumberland Gap into Boonesboro and into Kentucky. We also see the trail of there being a trail that comes off of Braddock's Road and takes us to Wheeling, which will be a major way then for especially Quakers later on to get into Belmont and Columbiana County. One of the things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with trails is, why are they there? Why there instead of somewhere else? And one of the major reasons why some of these became major trails was because of the gaps in the mountain, because of the way to get through the mountain rather than over it. And Eldridge provides a map of the various Blue Ridge gaps. She also provides a map of Kentucky County and the Kentucky settlement area and the pass into Boonesboro and then farther north. Now, looking from the perspective of Ohio, recognize that we have the Ohio Land Office opening up about 1800, thereabouts. So we begin to have trails into Ohio out of Virginia. And the one that is probably the most famous trail into Ohio is the National Road, which they start building at about 1807. Folks have been wandering around that area for a little bit of time, and that pretty much lays out why it's being laid that way. Also, it's the straightest way to St. Louis. And don't forget that St. Louis exists in this time frame as a French settlement, then a British settlement, and now an American settlement after the Revolution. Also at this time period, you have, going from Zanesville to Lexington, Kentucky, you have Zane's Trace. That pretty much covers, a very good bibliography, but that pretty much covers Carrie Eldridge's look at Atlas of Appalachian Trails to the Ohio River. Did I put that up well enough? Straighten it out. So, if you've got early colonial, mid-Atlantic, Ohio, Kentucky stuff, it will be an interesting addition to your library. So, this is Craig, and this has been Just Genealogy, and today we've been discussing the Atlas of Trails the Atlas of Appalachian Trails to the Ohio River. By far, of all the books that she's done, my favorite because, hey, this is where I live. Y'all have a good day.